And this is part 2 of our little history lesson, and I just want to pick up where we left off at the end of the last video. After World War II, all of these high-level Nazi officials were brought over to the United States through Operation Paperclip. They weren't held accountable, and neither were any of the American and European royal families who were the financial contributors to the Nazi war effort. And a lot of them were the initial people that first formed the CIA. And so after World War II, when they no longer had Hitler to be their political puppet, Prescott Bush, George H.W. Bush's dad, W's grandfather, he was the guy who owned the Union Bank that was laundering the Nazi money. He, again, got away with this and needed a new political puppet to do his bidding, and that person's ended up being Richard Nixon. And how Richard Nixon got his start in politics was Prescott Bush put an ad in the newspaper that said, "Wanted, desperate man willing to do despicable things for cash." And Richard Nixon is the one who answered that newspaper ad. And when I first heard that in this documentary, I thought, no way could that be true. They have to be exaggerating. That can't be what the ad actually said. And you can actually look it up. That's exactly what it said. So that's very interesting to me that the person who wrote that ad went on to have a son and a grandson that became president of the United States. And the person who answered that ad also went on to become a president of the United States.
And with President Roosevelt gone, and their first Nazi glove puppet Hitler also deceased, it became necessary for Prescott Bush to find another young politician to sponsor. In true American fashion, he decided to advertise. He placed an ad in the LA Times which candidly explained that a group of rich businessmen was seeking a young, ambitious, immoral and most definitely malleable politician who might one day run for president. The ad was deliberately worded in this cynical way because they knew that only an evil, slimy and completely incorrigible little creep would ever dream of applying for the position. That was what they wanted, and that was what they got, in the shape of a certain Richard Nixon. Here being congratulated on his success by his new master, Prescott Bush. Having bought themselves a new political puppet, this nefarious band of 20th century robber barons now took stock of their situation. The Hitler Project, as this rich elite called it, could hardly have turned out very much better. Their businesses had made colossal profits. Prescott had got his Union Bank back. The communist menace they so wanted to contain had almost sunk back in the Middle Ages with the ravages of war, and best of all was that they had now achieved the very world domination which Hitler had dreamed about. They knew that in this new age of modern telecommunications and high-speed jet travel, they had become the first group of robber barons in human history to dominate the entire globe, because they realized there was now absolutely no one left who could stop them from doing whatever they wanted to do next. However, they also realized that bombed out and dilapidated Europe would not be able to bear another war for many decades. This was why they now decided that their obscene business profits could only keep coming in if they moved their game of phony war into the Third World. And this was how the CIA came to instigate conflict throughout the Middle East, Southeast Asia and Central America. So this was the real political world which the young Senator John F. Kennedy became a part of in 1950s America. It was a world ruled by a super-rich cabal of secret Nazis who had built the fascist war machine and concentration camps purely to protect themselves and their money from socialist Russia. Having avoided prosecution for the greatest crime in human history, they were confident that they could kill anyone and get away with it, particularly if it was someone who might interfere with their power to instigate phony wars in order to make huge fortunes by lending money and selling weapons to both sides.
So when Kennedy ended up being elected president instead of the CIA's boy, Richard Nixon, This created a problem for the CIA because they did not mesh well with Kennedy. After the Bay of Pigs, JFK was pissed at the CIA, and he said that he was going to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. And then, like, a week later, Kennedy's skull was shattered into 1,000 pieces. So we're going to watch this video from another documentary that I found that covers what the official story is that the Warren Commission put forward. These are the government's official conclusions. So if you are not a conspiracy theorist, this next video is what you have to believe.
The official government version of the murder, the Warren Commission report, found that Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Dallas School Book Depository building. They tell us that the first shot missed, that the second shot hit both Kennedy and the governor of Texas, and that the third shot, from behind, hit Kennedy in the head and killed him. But it's hard to watch the Zapruder film of Kennedy being thrown violently backward and to the left and not think that he was shot from the front. This is Dr. Cyril Wecht. As the former head of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, he is the expert elected by the experts to represent them.
If you have that kind of force slamming into the rear of somebody's head, then that should drive the individual forward. But instead we have him moving backward and to the left. That suggests the very distinct possibility of another shot having been fired in synchronized fashion from the right side, the so-called grassy knoll area.
If Kennedy had actually been shot from behind, as the government says, he ought to have a small entrance wound on the back of his head. And this is the Navy doctor that the government got to write this report, saying that Kennedy did have this small wound in the back of his head. But there are some things you should know about this doctor. In a standard examination, he should have examined Kennedy's clothing for bullet holes. He didn't. In a standard autopsy, he should have dissected all of Kennedy's wounds to trace the bullet's path. He didn't dissect any of Kennedy's wounds. He didn't even realize that Kennedy had a throat wound. He later claimed that these drawings of his were wrong and that the wounds were actually much higher. He lost Kennedy's brain, which is still missing, and then he burned his notes. He burned his notes. But perhaps we shouldn't be too hard on him, because this doctor, James Humes, had never done an autopsy involving gunshot wounds before in his life. So naturally, he was the government's first choice to perform the most important autopsy in American history.
So yeah, I think that's weird that they picked an amateur to do the autopsy for the President of the United States and then burned the notes afterwards. That seems very suspicious and indicative of a cover-up.
David Lifton has done an extensive examination of this time period between when the body was loaded onto the plane and when it arrived in Washington for the autopsy. Lifton first noticed that the doctors who received the body for the autopsy in Washington reported seeing wounds that looked different from the wounds described by the doctors in the Dallas emergency room. Why, he wondered, would the wounds appear so differently in Washington than they did in Dallas? Was it just that the doctors in Washington were lying? Or had the wounds somehow changed during the trip to Washington? He then found this report written by 2 FBI agents present at the autopsy. The report says that
it was apparent that surgery of the head area was done before the autopsy started.
What?
It was apparent that surgery of the head area was done before the autopsy started.
Someone casually walked up to Kennedy's casket, got out a knife, and began cutting on the president's head? How could this have happened?
What is very clear is that the president's body did not make an uninterrupted journey from Dallas to Bethesda. The reason for altering the body is that the body is the diagram of the shooting, and it's the most important evidence in the case. Someone wants to make it appear in the evidence that President Kennedy was struck twice from behind from the direction of the School Book Depository building, and to obliterate any evidence of frontal entry. That's my opinion about what these facts mean.
So, what do you think? Do you see what the FBI agents saw? Do you see apparent surgery in this photo? Well, you're no expert, but this is certainly what any amateur might call apparent surgery. In fact, it doesn't look like a bullet wound at all. It looks like some Boy Scout got out his pocket knife and crudely cut a V in the president's scalp and then ripped the skin back. But why? Looking at a black and white version, it is possible to see a probable bullet hole here. This is also, by the way, where the president's press secretary said that the president was shot. So we have strong reason to believe that there is an entrance wound on this part of the president's head, and that the surgery we see here was an attempt, as Lifton says,
to obliterate any evidence of frontal entry.
So the fact that all of these things happened to JFK after the assassination occurred, like to these changes to the wounds on his body that had to have occurred in transit from Dallas to Washington, D.C., it had to have been an inside job. There's no way that the mafia or the Russians, the Cubans, none of those other theories would explain how that happened. It had to have been someone within the inner government circle. One of the ways that I think the CIA, the media, is good at muddying the waters when it comes to the JFK assassination is, you just put out a ton of conspiracy theories. So that way lets people just debate about it and act like it's this unsolvable mystery. But what they also do is get you focused on debating about the wrong issues. So a lot of people will debate on whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald could have fired 3 shots in that time frame. You could debate all day long on whether or not he could have done that, whether or not he was a good enough shooter to be able to hit the moving target. Nobody disputes the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, could not have fired more than 3 within that time frame. There is proof that the first shot missed. And then the third shot is obviously the headshot that killed Kennedy. So the second bullet had to have been responsible for all the other injuries that occurred to JFK and the governor of Texas that was sitting in the front seat of the car. This is what the government tells us happened with this one bullet that caused all of these wounds.
The FBI and Warren Commission concluded that Oswald, or anyone else shooting with this rifle, could only have fired 3 shots in the 6 seconds during which the shooting took place. Since the first shot missed, that means, except for Kennedy's head wound, all the other wounds to Kennedy and all the wounds to Governor Connally sitting in front of him had to have been caused by a single bullet. This anti-conspiracy theory, that there was only one shooter, is completely dependent upon this single bullet theory. The anti-conspiracy theory says that this single bullet entered the president's back headed downward at an angle of 17 degrees. Then, while inside the president's body, the bullet reversed direction and moved upward, necessarily piercing and exiting Kennedy's spine, a major bone structure, in order to leave the president's body from the front of his neck. According to the official theory, the bullet then waited 1.6 seconds, presumably in midair, before turning right, and then left. The bullet then headed downward, now at an angle of 27 degrees, shattering Connally's 5th rib and exiting from the same side of his chest. The bullet then turned right again and struck Governor Connally in his right wrist, shattering the radius bone. The bullet then exited Connally's wrist, made a dramatic left turn, and buried itself into Connally's left thigh, from which, according to the official theory, it later fell out and was found in absolutely perfect condition, without a trace of blood on it, in a corner of Dallas's Parkland Hospital, on a stretcher not in any way connected with the case.
I've watched episodes of Joe Rogan where he talks to his guests about the JFK assassination and this single bullet theory, and I don't necessarily agree with him, but he has made the point that it's possible that a bullet could do all of that because it's bouncing off of bone when it's inside your body, and that could change its trajectory. To me, that still seems like a whole lot of trajectory changes to be ping-ponging around in multiple people's bodies like that. This bullet that they found on this stretcher in the hospital was in almost pristine condition. So this next clip will actually show you what that bullet looks like. And to me, that does not look like a bullet that has been through a demolition derby, bouncing off multiple people's bones and causing all of these other injuries with 2 different people.
Substantial bullet fragments were recovered from Connally's leg and wrist. These are the fragments from his wrist. But the bullet that was found on the hospital stretcher was completely undamaged and was not missing any fragments.
To find out if a bullet could break so many bones and remain apparently intact, the commission used a rifle similar to Oswald's.
These two bullets were fired into cotton wadding, striking nothing. You will note that these bullets both have a minimal degree of protrusion of the lead at the base. Otherwise, they are intact, which is what you would expect. The next bullet broke one rib of a goat carcass. Notice, please, its widening. This bullet struck one of the two large bones that come down from the elbow to the wrist in a human cadaver. They wanted to simulate the fracture of that same bone in Governor Conley. Please note the substantial deformity. This is classical, typical, when a bullet strikes a dense, heavy bone or some other very firm object. Now, I want you to look at the so-called stretcher bullet. This bullet is the actual bullet that the Warren Commission claims broke both John Conley's right fifth rib, destroying 4 inches of that bone, pulverizing it, and which caused a comminuted or extensively fragmented fracture of a dense, heavy bone down near the base of the wrist, and emerged in this condition. You will see that it is near pristine. As a matter of fact, its nose, the cone, the sides of the bullet are completely intact and unscathed.
I just don't believe that that bullet could cause all of those injuries, multiple different people, and come out looking like that. Once you conclude, though, that the Warren Commission is lying about this, then they are the likely suspects. They are the number one target, the mob, the Russians, the Cubans. They don't have the power to make our government lie and cover it up. So with an inside job being the obvious conclusion to me in this scenario, is we're going to look at a couple of pieces of circumstantial evidence that I think help solidify that argument as being true. If you watch the Zapruder film, everybody's attention is normally focused on the back seat on President Kennedy. But if you watch closely, you will see the actions of the limo driver and the other agent riding in the front seat. They are actually turned around watching Kennedy get shot multiple times, and they don't turn around and speed off until after they see Kennedy receive the final headshot. It's almost as though they were intentionally trying to keep him in the line of fire until they knew for certain that the mission was a success.
They failed to provide Kennedy with the protection necessary to make sure that all the windows were closed in Dealey Plaza. They failed to provide him with Secret Service men on the back or on the sides of his limousine. They failed to provide him with a protective motorcycle escort. However, they did provide Kennedy with a driver who, film shows, was braking until after the fatal shot to the president. In these frames, close to 12 shots have been fired. The president and Governor Connolly already have 5 wounds between them. There's a hole in the middle of the windshield, and the driver is braking at 12 miles per hour. But watch this. Again, look at the driver. What is he doing? His training says that he should be speeding away from the scene. His partner is supposed to have jumped in the back seat, thrown the president to the floor, and jumped on top of him to shield him. But in this frame, they are both completely turned around, watching the president die. Why? What possible explanation is there for this extraordinary behavior? It is not until the driver sees the president receive the fatal shot to the head that he finally turns around and drives off at top speed. Now, you can invent an explanation for this behavior if you choose to. But then you have to invent an explanation for why this man was never questioned by the investigators about his most unusual behavior. The most obvious explanation is that his job was to keep the president in the line of fire until he was dead.
The other interesting part about the single bullet theory is that it was actually not the official story that came out in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. The first official story was that the first shot is the one that hit Kennedy. The second shot is the one that hit Governor Conley, the Texas governor, sitting in front of Kennedy in the limousine. and then the third shot was the fatal headshot to Kennedy. It wasn't until video footage showed that that first shot definitely missed that then they had to come up with this single bullet theory. So that's also interesting, the convenience of when that story came out. But Governor Connolly's actions here are also very suspect, because when the official story was that the first shot did not miss, that is what Connolly said happened. Said that he turned around and he saw that Kennedy had been shot, and then he got hit. Once the government had to change their story, Governor Connolly's story changed. Now he is supposed to have gotten hit by that same bullet, so there's no way that he could have turned around and saw that Kennedy was already shot. Now his story has changed to he doesn't see that Kennedy got shot. That's a very important thing to change your story about. That's a pretty big detail to get wrong. And again, it's fascinating that his story changes at exactly the time that the government needs his story to change.
So, the official story on the day of the murder was that there were 3 shots, that the first one hit Kennedy in the back, the second hit Connolly, and the third hit the president in the head, and he slumped. And this is the version of events that the governor is supporting here.
We had just turned the corner. We heard a shot. I turned to look in the back seat. The president had slumped. He had said nothing. Almost simultaneously, as I turned, I was hit. And I knew I'd been hit badly.
But later, the Warren Commission looked at the Zapruder film and saw clearly that the first shot had missed, and they came up with the ridiculous single bullet theory. But if Connolly and Kennedy had been hit by the same bullet, Connolly could not have looked in the back seat and seen that the president had been hit before he was hit. And so it was necessary for Connolly to change his story, and he did.
Unquestionably, when the first shot was fired, I recognized it as a shot. I thought of nothing else but that it was a rifle shot. I turned to my right. I had time to think. I had time to react. And I turned to my right to look back over my right shoulder to see if I could see anything unusual, and particularly to see if I could catch the president out of the corner of my eye, because I immediately thought of an assassination attempt the moment I heard the shot. I didn't see anything except just the general blur of waving of people moving. Nothing really unusual. I did not see the president out of the corner of my eye, and I was in the process.
They needed Connolly to say he saw the president slump, then that's what he said he saw. When they later needed him not to have seen the president slump before he was hit, then he didn't see him. It certainly appears that Connolly is a tool of the killers, doesn't it? Nixon's chief of staff says that everyone was astonished, flabbergasted in 1970, the day that Nixon announced that he was bringing John Connolly into the White House as his Secretary of the Treasury. No one understood the connection between these two, one the leader of the Republican Party, and the other the number 2 Texas Democrat, who was sitting in front of Kennedy when his brains were blown out, who sat holding his Stetson, looking calmly forward and pretending that nothing was going on, when he says that he had just heard at that very moment what he clearly recognized as a rifle shot, who held Kennedy's hand and led him into the killing zone.
One of the people who they suspect as being one of the assassins in the JFK is a guy named E. Howard Hunt, who has CIA connections also to the Bay of Pigs. And he was actually arrested as one of the plumbers in the Watergate break-in.
Nixon chose E. Howard Hunt to lead his private White House goon squad, the so-called Plumbers Unit. Hunt became famous as the head of the Watergate burglars. But after his arrest for breaking into the Watergate Hotel, while he was sitting in jail, Hunt suddenly began sending messages to Nixon that he needed $2 million to keep his mouth shut. This was earth-shaking news. Hunt was threatening to tell about the Kennedy assassination if Nixon didn't get him the hell out of jail and get him $2 million. Nixon sent word to the FBI director that he had to stop investigating Hunt's activities in Mexico. Nixon said that the FBI investigation would threaten to uncover the whole Bay of Pigs thing. The whole Bay of Pigs thing? What is that supposed to mean? Bob Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff and closest advisor. He wrote, "It seems that in all those references to the Bay of Pigs, he was actually referring to the Kennedy assassination." Nixon was forced to resign based upon the single charge that he tried to stop the FBI from investigating Hunt. And, according to Haldeman, Nixon told the FBI that investigating Hunt would uncover the whole Kennedy assassination thing.
So Richard Nixon taped all of his phone conversations or recorded all the conversations that took place in the Oval Office. And when they subpoenaed those tapes for the Watergate investigation, there's this chunk that's like 17 minutes long that's just missing from one of the tapes. It's like right in the middle of it, so it's pretty obvious that someone deleted that chunk of the tape. And it's never been recovered. And the predominant allowed mainstream media conspiracy theory that you're allowed to discuss is that, oh, well, that's Richard Nixon deleting the conversation where he admitted to knowing about the Watergate break-in. It's like, the problem with that, though, is later in those tapes, Richard Nixon discusses knowing about the Watergate break-in and helping cover it up. So if you're going to take the trouble to very obviously delete this one 17-minute chunk where you talk about it, why would you leave in this other part? So I am wondering if this missing 17-minute chunk is when Nixon and whoever he is talking to in his office are discussing the Howard Hunt connection to the JFK assassination. That it's going to uncover this whole Bay of Pigs thing. This 17-minute conversation took place before they started using the code phrase Bay of Pigs to refer to the Kennedy assassination. So that is my theory. I think that makes far more sense because the official explanation from Nixon on how this missing 17 minutes happened was that his secretary accidentally deleted it. This woman says that she sat like this with her foot here on this pedal that supposedly was accidentally deleting the recording, but there's phone records that showed she was on the phone at the time, so she's explaining how for 17 minutes she sat like that. I don't believe her. So that seems very uncomfortable, very long time to sit like that, and it seems to me much more likely that Nixon was talking about something that he didn't want people to hear, and it doesn't seem likely that it's about the Watergate break-in since they are fine talking about that later. It has to be something bigger than that, and the Kennedy assassination and Nixon and Hunt's connections to it would definitely be something big enough that you would rather have an obvious obstruction of evidence than you would want that evidence to be left on tape. And this next video is going to show some of the H.W. Bush connections to the JFK assassination, because this guy is very sketchy. He is one of the few people that I'm aware of who says that he doesn't remember where he was when he found out that Kennedy was assassinated. And then you find out later that he actually was in Dallas at the time, and like an hour after the assassination was calling the FBI and giving them false tips on who the shooter was. And how he does not remember that and being involved in that is beyond me. But he also lied to Congress when he was doing his confirmation hearing to be the FBI director, because he said under oath that he was not employed by the CIA, that he was an outside hire. And there was this memo that was released about a decade later where J. Edgar Hoover from the FBI, he had written a memo that said that with a couple days after the Kennedy assassination, the FBI met with a representative from the CIA who was supervising this group who was an anti-Castro group. And the CIA representative that came to speak to the FBI about it was George Bush. And George Bush's response is just like, that's not me. That's another George Bush. And again, I don't believe him. What are the odds that there's another George Bush that works for the CIA?
Remember, he knew that the Bushes were Nazis. He knew that Prescott Bush was a frontline operative for the biggest Nazis on the planet. These Nazis were not Hoover's friends. He had busted them in 1942. Look at this bombshell that Hoover dropped on the Bushes 5 days after the assassination. It was released by the FBI in 1977, hidden under a pile 100,000 pages high. It took 15 years for researchers to find it. It's signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself, and the title is Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. That's a big hint, I think, as to what the memo is about. It says that it's about a meeting that took place between the FBI and the CIA the day after the assassination. What the memo does do is name Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency as a CIA officer associated with the CIA's misguided anti-Castro groups. It suggests that Bush was the person at the CIA responsible for these people. And in stark black and white, it says that the CIA sent Mr. George Bush to Washington the day after the assassination to answer for them, when the FBI had questions about the activities of some misguided anti-Castro group. It means that Bush lied, committed perjury when he told the Senate under oath that he had no CIA experience before becoming director in 1974. It means that he was in the CIA when he ran for Senate and lost in 1964, and when he ran for Senate and lost in 1970. And it means that he was in the CIA when Nixon brought Bush into the White House, trailing E. Howard Hunt behind him. Bush was first confronted with his memo in 1992, and he had a chance to respond to it. Bush claimed that the memo must be talking about another George Bush working at CIA because it couldn't be talking about him, because he had never been in the CIA. The George Bush of this memo is essentially being named by Hoover as being directly implicated in the assassination. It makes a huge difference if this was our George Bush or some other George Bush. Is there any other evidence besides this memo to show whether Bush was in the CIA at this time or shows whether Bush was supervising anti-Castro Cubans? This FBI document records that on the day of the assassination at 1:45 p.m., 1 hour and 15 minutes after the shooting, Bush was already involved in trying to misdirect the FBI in their efforts to catch the killers. This document records that Mr. George Bush telephonically furnished the following: that he recalled hearing in recent weeks, the day and source unknown, that one James Parrott had been talking of killing the president when he comes to Houston. How could you not remember when or where you heard someone say that he was going to kill the president? It's little wonder, then, that this FBI agent took time from the busiest day of his career to record this screwy phone call. He wanted to be sure to record the name and occupation of this very suspicious caller. And we see, then, that Bush was not out of town on vacation. He was actively involved in matters related to the assassination. When questioned about this FBI document, Bush said that he does not recall making the phone call. Now, wait 1 minute. Everyone in the country can tell you exactly where they were and what they were doing when Kennedy was killed. He was busy calling the FBI to misinform them, but he doesn't remember? His failure to recall such dramatic events puts him into a unique club. Like Nixon and Hunt, he can't seem to remember the events of November 22, 1963. But this incredible memo does not stand by itself. The secret code name for the Bay of Pigs invasion was Operation Zapata. Now, you could fairly ask what kind of idiot would give a secret operation a secret code name and name it after his own company that was operating in the area. George Bush, that's what kind of idiot. Bush has a habit of naming things in his military career after things in his personal life. He named 2 planes after his wife, and one of the 3 CIA ships at the Bay of Pigs was renamed the Barbara. It's a small piece that just happens to fit perfectly with the bigger picture of Bush as a CIA officer working with anti-Castro Cuban terrorists. Finding the name of Bush's wife on a CIA supply ship, or finding the code name for the Bay of Pigs invasion on his oil company, is a small but clear detail of this much bigger picture. The Hoover memo is not circumstantial evidence. It is direct, eyewitness, smoking gun evidence from the most influential figure in the history of American law enforcement. The rest of the evidence merely provides a context for this memo that makes it impossible to reasonably believe that the former president was not involved in the murder of John Kennedy, acting as a frontline operative for
The military-industrial complex.
who Kennedy had threatened to destroy just 4 days before his death.
And it wouldn't be a complete episode of Genuine Questions without me dogging on the media's role in all of this.
The most shocking thing about the assassination is not the brutality of it. It was brutal, certainly. But the most amazing thing is the way the established media today managed to pretend that there's any question of whether his murder was a conspiracy. Dr. Hume's story about a small entrance wound on the back of Kennedy's head is today the official government version. But this is not the story that the New York Times told on the day that Kennedy died. Later in the afternoon, Dr. Malcolm Perry, an attending surgeon, and Dr. Kemp Clark, chief of neurosurgery at Parkland Hospital, gave more details. Mr. Kennedy was hit in the throat just below the Adam's apple, they said. This wound had the appearance of a bullet's entry wounds on the front. Mr. Kennedy also had a massive gaping wound in the back and one on the right side of the head. This information did not start off as a secret. It was made into a secret by the constant authoritative denial of the truth. The lying continues today.
40 years after the assassination, the latest ABC News poll tells us that more than 2/3 of Americans still believe there was a conspiracy to kill the president. What we will do tonight is demonstrate that those theories are wrong.
Of course, he will have to lie to do that. This is Malcolm Kilduff, Kennedy's assistant press secretary. He is speaking at a press conference at the Dallas hospital where the president has just been pronounced dead. Please notice the ABC logo. This is from Jennings' video.
He died of a gunshot wound in the brain.
And they fade the scene out. No more press conference. But now watch this. The same press secretary, the same press conference, no ABC logo.
Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound in the brain. Dr. Berkeley told me it's a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head.
The press secretary tried to show us how the head wound was inflicted, but Jennings cut that out because it destroys the lie that he was trying to tell. But we're just supposed to take Jennings' word for it. This sort of take my word for it is standard operating procedure for newspeople like Jennings.
In all these years, there has not been a single piece of credible evidence to prove a conspiracy.
In fact, 100% of the medical personnel in Dallas who saw the president's wounds described a large exit wound in the back of the head about this size and location. Virtually all the witnesses near the grassy knoll say they heard a shot from that direction, and dozens of them chased after the gunman who fired that shot. And Jennings' response to this mountain of proof is,
All these years, there has not been a single piece of credible evidence to prove a conspiracy.
So that's what I think was really going on with the JFK assassination. This cabal of secret Nazis who were unaccountable for what happened with World War II. They were allowed to form the CIA. Nixon was supposed to be their puppet that gets elected, but Kennedy wins instead. And now Kennedy is threatening to shut down this pretty sweet system that they've got going on over here, so they assassinate him. And then it's a coup, and they've been running the show ever since, just using politicians as their political puppets. And that's the two-party system. As long as they keep the left versus the right fighting with each other, then we're going to keep voting for the lesser of two evils. Ultimately, they don't care which one because they control the politicians on both sides. And as long as we're voting for either a Democrat or a Republican, you're really voting for the CIA to continue to be allowed to operate at their whim. So the next video will go into details about some of the ways I think the CIA is pulling the levers and has been manipulating us all through the years up until the present day. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I appreciate you guys watching Genuine Questions.